On June 25, 1876, I witnessed one of the most tragic and debated moments in the history of the American West, the event now known as Custer's Last Stand. On that day, General George Armstrong Custer led over 260 of us, his men from the 7th Cavalry Regiment, to our deaths by the Little Bighorn River as we faced an overwhelming force of Lakota Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. Over time, this battle has been covered in myth, often portraying Custer as a hero who met his end in a doomed yet valiant fight. However, what I saw, and what others like George Herendeen and John Berkman experienced, presents a much darker and more complex picture. Amid the chaos and terror, we came to realize that the romanticized tales of Custer's bravery didn't capture the true horror of that day. The reality was far more brutal, and nothing could have prepared us for the scale of destruction that unfolded. In this account, I will share the chilling details of what truly happened, from the unbearable heat and thirst that tormented us to the relentless, unstoppable assault by the Native American warriors. These first-hand experiences reveal the raw and terrifying truth of one of the darkest days in U.S. military history. Our ill-fated expedition began on June 22, 1876. That day, Custer led us, the 7th Cavalry, away from our camp near the Rosebud River, heading toward what we believed would be a decisive engagement with the Native American tribes. These tribes had been resisting the U.S. government's attempts to force them onto reservations. The march was long and exhausting, but many of us were encouraged by Custer's reputation. He was fearless and had earned distinction during the Civil War. We trusted in him. The heat was relentless. I remember the sun scorching us as we crossed the rugged terrain of what is now southeastern Montana. The horses grew weary from the strain, but there was no time for rest. Each night, we set up camp only to rise early the next morning and continue the march. On June 23rd, we marched another 12 miles before setting up camp for the night. By dawn, we were back on the move, following a trail that led us deeper into hostile territory. Tensions began to rise as we entered unfamiliar land. We knew we were walking into danger, but most of us still felt a quiet confidence in Custer's leadership. There was an underlying belief that no challenge was too great for us to overcome. On June 24th, tensions escalated. Custer had dispatched 6 Crow scouts earlier to gather intelligence, and when they returned, they brought information that would alter the course of our march. They had discovered fresh pony tracks, clear evidence of a nearby large Native American village. This revelation should have prompted caution, but instead, Custer appeared even more resolute in his intent to engage. That evening, he convened a council with his officers, though the rest of us remained unaware of the discussions. All we knew was that a decision had been made. We were pressing forward. Around 11 p.m. that night, we packed up and resumed our march under the cover of darkness, following the right fork of the Rosebud Creek. We moved steadily onward, oblivious to the fact that we were heading directly toward one of the bloodiest battlefields in American history. As dawn broke on June 25th, Custer's scouts returned with even more unsettling news. They had located the village. It lay nestled in the valley, only 3 miles from our current position. The village was far larger than we had anticipated, with thousands of warriors already preparing for battle. The Crow scouts urged Custer to reconsider his plans, warning that our presence had likely been detected. If there had ever been an element of surprise, it was now gone. Mitch Boyer, a mixed-blood scout, was particularly vocal, advising Custer to proceed cautiously. He and other scouts feared we were walking into a trap. The growing tension was palpable among us, but Custer refused to retreat. He remained steadfast in his belief that we could still achieve victory. As we advanced, an uneasy weight began to settle over me. The dust clouds in the distance, once thought to signify a retreating village, now seemed to hint at something far more menacing. We were marching directly into enemy territory, and it became increasingly clear that this battle would be unlike any we had ever faced. By midday, we reached an abandoned Indian village located 2 miles below the forks of the Rosebud. We briefly set up camp, though none of us knew how long we would remain there. Just as we prepared to move again, the scouts returned with news that Sioux war parties had spotted our approach. The enemy was ready for us. The swirling dust clouds in the distance painted an ominous picture. Custer interpreted them as evidence of Native Americans on the move, possibly retreating. Determined not to let an opportunity for a swift and decisive victory slip away, he ordered Colonel Marcus Reno to lead an attack. Reno and his detachment crossed the river at a natural ford and began advancing across the open prairie. His objective was to engage the enemy directly, while Custer maneuvered to flank them from another position. Initially, Reno's assault seemed to unfold as planned. His men dismounted and organized into skirmish lines, preparing for a fight on foot. Their horses were safely sheltered among the trees along the riverbank. The first shots were fired, and for a fleeting moment, it appeared that the Native American forces might falter under the pressure. However, it quickly became evident how mistaken we were. In mere minutes, the situation shifted dramatically. A large force of Lakota, Sioux, and Cheyenne warriors, mounted and armed with bows, arrows, and rifles, charged at Reno's advancing troops. The swiftness and precision of their attack left the soldiers completely stunned. Panic began to spread. John Berkman, a soldier in Reno's detachment, later described the terror of the moment. We thought we were advancing into battle, but suddenly we found ourselves surrounded. The Indians were everywhere, shooting from horseback. We couldn't see where they were coming from, and men were falling all around me. Reno's men were quickly overwhelmed. The native warriors outflanked their position, cutting off their retreat toward the river. Recognizing the imminent danger of encirclement, Reno made the critical decision to fall back into the timber. While the trees offered some cover, the relentless pursuit of the warriors continued. As the soldiers fled, many were struck down by arrows or rifle fire, while others were trampled by charging warriors. The scene devolved into chaos, and Reno's retreat turned into a rout. I spotted Berkman along with about 13 other soldiers huddled in the trees, desperately trying to evade the onslaught of bullets and arrows. He later recounted it to me as one of the most terrifying experiences of his life. It felt like the world was closing in on us. While Reno's men were being forced into the timber, Custer and the rest of us pressed further into the valley, unaware of the calamity unfolding behind us. Custer, interpreting the dust clouds as a sign of retreat, remained resolute in his plan. Determined to strike the village directly and scatter the warriors, he pushed us forward to continue the attack. But rather than retreating, the native forces lay in wait for us. Before we realized what was happening, we were engulfed by a sea of Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. Our detachment, consisting of only about 210 men, was hopelessly outnumbered by the estimated 2,500 native warriors surrounding us. George Herendeen, who served alongside me under Custer's command that day, described the moment we understood the peril we were in. It was as if the ground opened up beneath us, he said. One moment we were advancing, and the next, warriors were everywhere, surging at us from all directions like a wave crashing against the shore. The assault was both ferocious and swift. Native warriors, commanded by leaders like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, attacked with astonishing speed. We were taken by surprise, and it soon became evident that we were hopelessly outnumbered. We scrambled to organize defensive positions, but it was already too late. Herendeen later recounted the chaos of the scene. Half the time, we couldn't even see the enemy. The dust kicked up by the horses and the deafening roar of gunfire, it was like trying to fight a storm. We resisted as fiercely as we could, but the sheer numbers and unyielding resolve of the native warriors overwhelmed us. One by one, the men around me fell. The battle turned into a slaughter, and Custer himself was killed, along with most of his command. While we were being annihilated in the valley, Reno's men were stranded on the bluffs, fighting to hold their position. They had regrouped and managed to establish a defensive stance, but they were cut off from the river and suffering from a desperate lack of water. The scorching heat compounded their misery, and many soldiers were succumbing to dehydration. I joined Reno's men by this point, and the agony of going so long without water remains etched in my memory. We hadn't had a drop of water in over 36 hours, Herendeen told me. Men were collapsing from thirst, their tongues swollen so badly they couldn't even speak. Attempts to eat hardtack and crackers from our rations were futile without water to help swallow. Some men resorted to chewing grass in a desperate bid to find relief, but it did little to quench their torment. As time went on, the situation became increasingly desperate. The wounded were in agony, and we feared that the native warriors could launch another attack at any moment. In a bid to secure water, a group of soldiers volunteered to make a run for the river. This meant crossing an exposed area under a relentless barrage of enemy fire. Despite the extreme danger, about 50 men took on the task. They raced across the open ground, evading bullets and arrows, and managed to reach the river. They hurriedly filled their camp kettles and canteens, but the price was steep. Several soldiers were injured during the effort, and one lost his life. Although the water brought back was enough to alleviate some of the wounded suffering, for many it was already too late. As night fell on June 25th, we steeled ourselves for another attack. Using whatever we could find, saddles, packs, and even the corpses of dead horses, we constructed makeshift barricades. The battlefield fell into an eerie silence, broken only by faint sounds of mourning from the Native American camp. Herendeen later described the scene as deeply unsettling. "It was like the calm before the storm," he said. "We knew the Indians were out there, watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike." Throughout the night, we remained on high alert, bracing for a final assault that never came. The native warriors had returned to their village to grieve their losses, leaving behind only a small force to keep us pinned down. When dawn broke on June 26th, many of the men were nearing their physical and mental limits. Having gone nearly 2 days without sleep, water, or adequate food, some became delirious from dehydration, while others simply sat in silence, staring blankly. By mid-morning on June 27th, our prayers were answered. General Alfred Terry and his reinforcements arrived at the battlefield, bringing much-needed relief. Cheers erupted as Terry's column approached, signaling the end of our harrowing ordeal. We had spent 2 days trapped on the bluffs, awaiting what had seemed like certain death. However, our relief was short-lived. As Terry's forces surveyed the battlefield, the full scale of the devastation became apparent. The remains of Custer and his men lay scattered across the valley, many mutilated beyond recognition. In the days that followed, as we worked to recover the bodies of the fallen, the grim reality of what had transpired sank in. Many of Custer's men had been mutilated by Native American warriors and their families, a final act of vengeance for years of broken treaties and enduring conflict. I witnessed the aftermath firsthand. The bodies were scalped, decapitated, and dismembered. In some instances, strips of skin had been removed, and small bullet wounds were visible on the legs, indicating that certain soldiers had been tortured before their deaths. Among the fallen was Isaiah Dorman, a black scout who had fought alongside us. His body bore numerous small bullet wounds, suggesting he had been captured alive and subjected to torture before being killed. For the Native American warriors, the mutilation of our bodies was not merely an act of vengeance. It was a cultural practice. It represented their way of reclaiming honor and exacting retribution for the countless lives taken by the U.S. Army. Over the years, the story of Custer's last stand has been mythologized and transformed into legend. Custer is often depicted as a tragic hero, a man who valiantly fought against overwhelming odds. But for those of us who were there, the reality was far more nuanced. Custer's arrogance and refusal to heed the warnings of his scouts led to the massacre of his men. The battle, along with its gruesome aftermath, left wounds that would endure for generations. For the Native American tribes, the victory at Little Bighorn was a significant triumph, but it was fleeting. Within a few years, the U.S. Army returned with greater strength, and the power of the Plains tribes was ultimately crushed. We, the survivors, would carry the weight of that day's memories with us for the rest of our lives. The events of June 25, 1876, stand as a stark reminder of the perils of arrogance, overconfidence, and the heavy toll of war. The first-hand accounts of men like George Herendeen, John Berkman, and others who survived the battle reveal a story of fear, chaos, and incomprehensible loss. While the myths surrounding Custer's last stand endure, the true narrative of that day is far more sobering. Ultimately, Custer's last stand serves as a cautionary tale. Even the most revered leaders can fall victim to their own errors. The legacy of that battle, for both the U.S. Army and the Native American tribes, is one of profound loss, of lives, of land, and of a way of life that would soon be irreparably altered.